Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Buzzanco and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the Green and Red podcast. This is Bob Buzzanco. Scott's not here today. I think he's in Washington trying to whip up some votes to become speaker. Very excited today to talk to somebody who I've been reading for a long time and who's been in the news a lot lately, Jefferson Morley, who's a really well-known journalist, longtime Washington journalist, has been an editor for both New Republican Nation and the Washington Post, which is where I discovered you when I used to live out there. Written a lot about intelligence and the CIA, and more recently the Kennedy assassination. The author of a book on Win Scott, who was a CIA officer in Mexico City, called, I believe, Our Man in Mexico. A book on the famous or infamous, depending on how you look at him, James Jesus Angleton, the ghost, the secret life of CIA spy master, James Jesus Angleton. And then most recently, Scorpion's Den, the president, the spy master in Watergate. Also, and as a historian, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. You've been involved for a long time now in declassification issues, because that's one thing that, if you're in the archives, you always deal with, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But you've done a lot in terms of getting documents declassified, and a lot of that stuff, I think people who don't, like, a lot of it obviously is about the assassination, but I found a ton of really good stuff in there, just like basic policy documents on Vietnam and Cuba and things like that.
Yeah.
And more recently, you've been in the news because of this new trove of documents. I don't know if it's big enough to call it a trove, but that you've found, and you've done some FOIA and mandatory review work on, and you're now say that there's a particular collection that has a smoking gun on the Kennedy assassination. So having said all that, and this is something, I've been working on for quite some time too. And so it's good that we can, chat about this and not go back and forth on Twitter, which is a horrible,
right. A horrible thing. Yeah.
It is. But first, why don't you just kind of give us a little background, like what happened? What do you think happened on November 22nd, 1963, and who was in on it?
Well, let me just back up and explain a little bit about where I'm coming from when I answer that question. And thanks for referencing my three CIA books, because they are the foundation of what I'm talking about. When I got interested in the Kennedy assassination in the 90s was when new records began to come into the National Archives as a result of the JFK Records Act. And for the first time, there was, original archival material related to the assassination that was open for inspection. As I looked at the subject, I mean, I thought it was ridiculous to think that I could solve the assassination. I was just looking for news, something news, that would illuminate the story, but not solve the assassination. I'd read a lot of the assassination books. It wasn't. I didn't find many of the books very good, and so I was kind of dissatisfied with the factual foundation. And I realized that when I came across the story of Win Scott in 1994, 1995, a lawyer friend of mine called me and said, "Jeff, you got to write about this guy. He's got a great story." And he introduced me to his client, Michael Scott, who was Win Scott's son. And so Win Scott had died when Michael was a teenager, and in his midlife, he sort of made it his hobby to get to know his dad, who he hadn't really known as an adult. And he went around and started interviewing his father's friends and all that, and it was just kind of a personal hobby for Michael. And when my friend Mark introduced me to him, I wrote a story for the Washington Post style section, but I said, this is a great story. I'd love to do a book about it. So, and Michael said, yeah, that'd be fine. He wasn't a writer. He's more a movie producer, film director. But he said, sure, And so I said, and he had all this material, that it would be very hard to get otherwise, because his father's colleagues talked to him because they remembered him when he was a kid and visited the office, So somebody like Ian Goodpasture, who was Win Scott's right-hand man in the Mexico City station, she talked to Michael, and she talked to me because I was a friend of Michael's. I don't think Ann Goodpasture would have talked to me otherwise. So I had this huge head start, and I decided at that time, what I thought about the assassination. Who cares what I think? Have an opinion about it. There's 1,000 theories out there. Nobody would care what I got. But what did Win Scott think? I thought that was a really interesting question, because here's a guy who's way up in the CIA, a super loyalist, and had a front row seat because they had surveilled Lee Harvey Oswald in the Mexico City station, and they reported on him. And so, what did Win Scott think? So in each of my books, I repeated that sort of same methodology, which was for James Angleton. What did he think of the assassination? How did he act around it? He was the counterintelligence chief. And then in Scorpion's Dance, Dick Helms, who was the deputy director and then the director, how did Helms handle and think about the Kennedy assassination? So that's the background that I come to the story from, is what did this thing look like to insiders? And, one thing that impressed me more and more as I went along was, insiders didn't believe the official story. I mean, publicly they said they believed it, but privately they didn't believe it. And the list of people who didn't believe the Warren Commission is long. Lyndon Johnson, the man who appointed the Warren Commission, endorsed its findings, touted them to the public. He never believed it, and he said so openly on at least 3 different occasions. And so it's well documented. He talked to Marvin Watson, one of his aides, in 1967, and Watson spoke the next day on the phone to Cartha Deloge, the deputy director of the CIA, and Watson said, this was in 1967, that Johnson had told him he thought there was a conspiracy and that the CIA was behind it. When Johnson retired in 1969, a CBS camera crew came to his house, and he said that he did not believe Oswald had acted alone. He wouldn't let them use it on camera. He took it off the record. And Leo Janos, a writer for The Atlantic, also visited Johnson later in his retirement in 72, and Johnson said the same thing to Janos. So, Johnson didn't believe the Warren Commission. Jackie and Bobby Kennedy didn't believe the Warren Commission. Publicly, they said they did. Privately, they never believed it. Foreign leaders, Charles de Gaulle, Fidel Castro. Now you can say, well, those people are self-interested or whatever, but you can't say that they didn't know American politics and how power worked and all of that. Those were very canny men who understood how the CIA and they didn't believe the Warren Commission. They believed that Kennedy had been killed by enemies within his own government. I could go on and on. I mean, Win Scott came to not believe the Warren Commission and said as much in his. So there's this feeling the Warren Commission isn't right. It's very common in the upper levels of government. But so what's the explanation? Well, if you look at the story and very closely as a story that takes place in the intelligence milieu, I think the evidence becomes stronger and stronger that Oswald was a target of CIA manipulation. I mean, because one thing that we learned in the 1990s, but this is probably the most important thing that we learned since Oliver Stone's movie, and the media is not very good at kind of conveying realities like this. The most important thing we learned in the 1990s was the pre-assassination Oswald file. These are the documents that the CIA had on Oswald while Kennedy was still alive. If you look at those 42 documents and the routing slips on them, the first thing is the story of a lone nut who we didn't know anything about. That's nonsense, okay? It's a cover story. So the Warren Commission was fed a cover story about who Oswald was. CIA said, we didn't know much about this guy. He just slipped past us. We're really sorry, Mrs. Kennedy. And the government bought that incredibly. This is incredible. Not only was no one ever brought to justice for the crime, no one lost their job, right? These people who knew all about Oswald, the people who were writing cables about Oswald while Kennedy was still alive, they didn't lose their jobs because nobody knew about it. If everybody had known that 6 top officers reporting to Dick Helms and Jim Angleton knew about Oswald, knew about the lone nut 6 weeks before Dallas, they would have all lost their jobs. The CIA might have been reorganized. So, it was a very important cover-up to keep that story out of the record. And they're still trying to keep it out of the record. So I think the most consistent, what the preponderance of evidence tells us, is that, the president was killed by his enemies who had the ability to make it look like something else. And, there were people in the CIA who knew how to do that. Now, who were those people? That's really tough. That's where it gets hard to tell because, all those 6 aides signed off on that cable about Oswald. Well, they all reported to Helms or Angleton. Now, Helms and Angleton's name's not on there, but to me, it's hard to believe that one or both of them didn't know about Oswald before the assassination, and I'm pretty sure it was Angleton. So, what does that mean? What does that high-level interest mean? A second thing that we learned in the 90s, and this came to me in my book, as I did my books, was the use of deception operations, of false flag operations, of COINTELPRO style operation. Those were very common, we now know, or they were a tool of US policymakers and intelligence agencies. Operation Northwoods is a plan to provoke a war with Cuba. COINTELPRO is, to harass and disrupt and discredit, groups that oppose US policy or offend J. Edgar Hoover. So, those were really much more common and just how they worked. I mean, I don't think I knew until Northwoods came out really like what a false flag operation was. And I don't think most people do. It's interesting. That's a kind of social learning we've had in the last 20 years, which is important to where we're at now, is people know that, intelligence agencies do stuff like this, like false flag operations and misdirection. And so that's the second thing that we learned. And then the third thing was that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee itself, the organization that Oswald attached himself, was a specific target of the CIA in the fall of 1963, at the time Oswald was involved with them. So, the fact that Oswald has so much contact with CIA operational activity in the course of 1963, and how that information is circulated at the top of the CIA right away, I just think the evidence is adding up that there was something going on here. And what I brought to the table now is there's a body of records that I think will tell us who was doing this, who was interested in Oswald before the assassination, what was going on there. So that's what I put on the table and said, I think there's a CIA operation, an undisclosed CIA operation behind these records. And, the records that I'm talking about are known to exist. And, when we see them, which I hope we will, we'll see. Like, I could be wrong, right? I don't know for sure what's in them, but I think they fit into a larger pattern of operational activity and personality. So, I hope that we will see those records this year, and I think we'll have a very big change, or profound change in clarification of the JFK story in some manner.
I've been go ahead, I'm sorry.
So let me just say a couple more things. I've been very influenced by a talk that I heard a former CIA officer give, Rolf Mowat Larsen. He spoke at a JFK conference 3 years ago in Dallas, and he analyzed the Dealey Plaza, the crime scene where President Kennedy was assassinated, as the product of a covert operation, and sort of reasoning backwards. If it was, how would it have worked? And to think that way about Dealey Plaza by a guy who's run covert operations and was Moscow station chief, to me it was really compelling. And the point he made was extremely sophisticated operations that achieve huge amounts of whatever can be very tightly held. And he said he knows this from personal experience. Some of the most successful operations were only known to 3 or 4 people. even after they had been executed. And so the idea of what happened in Dealey Plaza as the work of covert operatives who are figuring out how to make the crime look like something else, he kind of went through that, and I found that very compelling. I think that that's an important part of the story, is the number of people who actually knew what happened and why might be tiny, and so people say, oh, how could you pull off such a thousands of people would have to have signed off on a conspiracy? And what Rolf is saying is no. It doesn't take thousands of people. It takes a very clever handful of people who are very tightly compartmentalized and protected by official secrecy to pull something like that off. Now, that Rolf doesn't pretend to identify who was involved in the CIA. We talk about that all the time. He points to different personalities. So who was in charge? I think that's, what we're looking at might be a very small group of people. And that's why this information is so tightly held 60 years later, because when something is compartmentalized, it's classified at a higher level. Fewer people can open up that box and look at that stuff.
Yeah.
And so, I think the documents that I'm seeking are probably classified at a very high level, and so people in the CIA might not have even looked at them,
Maybe they're at Mar-a-Lago.
Well, and there's a good question too. I mean, people ask me, did Trump take JFK documents to Mar-a-Lago? And I'm like, beats me, but he did take a lot of records,
Yeah. Let me now, are you saying it's a CIA plot or plan to get to Oswald and maybe flip him, or a CIA plan to kill Kennedy, or both?
I think the ostensible purpose was an operation against the Fair Play for Cuba committee.
Right, which based in the 1960s is pretty easy to believe. I mean, that's COINTELPRO. That's right. I've seen, I mean, I don't know intelligence records like you, but I've seen records where they were like surveilling John Kerry and VVAW. And I mean, these are ridiculous. Everybody, like, so-and-so stopped at a restroom, so-and-so went in and bought a glass, a pop, so no. So, I mean, and like, I think most people know, but Oswald had defected and lived in the Soviet Union for 2.5 years, so clearly he's on the radar. I mean, it's not hard to kind of know this guy, is needs to be watched, or should be, the way the government operates is going to watch him.
Okay, so but the first point is the Warren Commission was not told that. The Warren Commission was told we didn't watch this guy. When they did. So
and they believed it. I mean,
what's that?
Well, go ahead. No, there's
no. I mean, in terms of the government's story, right? The most sensitive thing from the start was Oswald and Cuba, and that's why, like, the records I'm going after, it's still the most sensitive thing. What the CIA knew about Oswald and Cuba, and Cuba operations. So, am I saying, I think there was an operation to manipulate Oswald, for these counterintelligence purposes against the Fair Play for Cuba committee. Right. Now,
that's easy to believe.
Yeah. Was that in concert with a plan to ambush the president in Dealey Plaza and lay the blame on Oswald? Maybe. Or alternatively, if you look at the evidence, you can say they were monkeying around with this guy and he up and shot the president and they had to hide it. And so that's what they're hiding, was, their incompetence, that they just didn't see the threat to the president. Now, in my experience, the CIA is not an incompetent organization. So incompetence is not my first analytical pick in this situation. But we don't know. I argue with friends who favor the incompetence theory, and I don't agree with it, but it could be. It could be.
I don't know if I call it incompetence, but I lean a bit in that direction. But like, one last thing, and then I want to talk about this, because I have actually a lot of is just kind of about the use of documents and the way the records are collected in intelligence. But just to kind of. So you think the CIA was, why? What was their motive? Why would even rogue elements of the CIA?
The senior echelons of the CIA and the Pentagon were quite disturbed by JFK's foreign policy by mid-1963. JFK has this deserved reputation as a hawk, as a person who escalated in Vietnam. But if you look at the last year of his presidency, after the missile crisis, basically, he becomes a much more dedicated dove.
Yeah, we'll disagree on that strongly.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I mean, at the time, he was excoriated by the political right wing. I mean, people can say now he was conservative. At the time, he was excoriated by the right and even the center right as a weakling, and by the far right as a traitor.
I mean,
So
I think the extreme, like Walker, John Birch, right? But I mean, I've looked at these documents extensively. I've written tons of stuff on Vietnam and Cuba, and I don't see anything in the documents indicating that, or any real distress with the chiefs. I don't know about the CIA per se, but
I'm only going on the official history of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
I read I've read parts. I was a consultant with one of them, so I know a little bit about that. And I mean,
the one by
not the
Rear,
ones on not the ones on JFK, but I'm familiar with the series quite well and quite
right.
deeply.
No, so I mean, this Reardon's history of the Joint Chiefs from 45 to 70, I think it is,
Yeah.
says, relations between the White House and the Joint Chiefs hit an all-time low after the missile crisis, that people felt Kennedy had made unnecessary concessions and didn't get rid of communism in Cuba. And the sign of the Joint Chiefs' distress that Kennedy's policy was too weak came on May 1st, 1963, when the Joint Chiefs approved for a second time Operation Northwoods. Now, at that time, that's in the month before, Kennedy had cracked down on the exiles in Cuba, in Miami, and said no more raids. All the guys who were running boats down and shooting up ships were given orders that they couldn't leave Dade County without government permission. So Kennedy cracked down. He was reviled in Cuba. There was no conservative, nobody on the right thought Kennedy was a hawk on Cuba. They reviled him. The Joint Chiefs thought his policy of sort of letting Bobby play case officer and maybe someday somebody will overthrow Castro. Dick Helms and those people thought that was ridiculous. They thought it was amateurish and unserious. They wanted to get rid of Castro.
But Kennedy did continue to. I mean, after the Cuban Missile Crisis in November, the CIA and Kennedy approved of an attack on a manufacturing.
Oh yeah, no,
that killed 400 people. They had operations in November.
They definitely continued to run hostile operations.
In April of 1963, right before May 1st, there's a meeting, and Kennedy says he's still committed to getting rid of Castro, but it has to be a Cuban operation. You can't run it out of Miami.
Right, and the Joint Chiefs responded to that. The Joint Chiefs responded to that on May 1st and said that policy is not going to work. And the policy that we need to do is the pretext operation.
Right, which they've been doing. I mean, if you've ever read Lansdale that's what they do. Lansdale had some incredible schemes in his mind about getting rid of Castro. That's not new.
No.
Was it the Chiefs or the CIA who wanted to get rid of Kennedy in that case then?
Well, let's take them one at a time.
Okay.
So the Joint Chiefs get together and they approve Northwoods unanimously. Okay. Northwoods is different than the half-baked schemes that Lansdale put forward. Right. Northwoods was, let's go in with the 82nd Airborne. Okay, let's create an incident. Let's stage a spectacular incident of violence on U.S. territory, blame it on Castro, use our trusted covert operatives, that's their phrase, to arrange for the blame to fall on Castro, and then we'll have a pretext for an invasion. So that's the Joint Chiefs policy on May 1st. Frankly, offered because they believe that Kennedy's policy is too weak. Okay. Now, what happened with Operation Northwoods is a very good question, because the paper trail that we have just stops. We don't know that McNamara ever took that, or Maxwell Taylor ever took that plan to Kennedy. We don't know that he ever turned it down. He had turned it down in March of '62, but we don't know what he did in May of it. So you asked before, was it a Joint Chiefs or a CIA plan? Well, if you looked at Northwoods was a Pentagon plan with a big CIA component. The Pentagon would handle the hardware, the kinetic side of such a false flag attack, and the CIA would handle the making it look like something else, or arranging for the blame to fall on Castro. So, so then fast forward to 6 months later, somebody stages a spectacular attack against a U.S. target, namely the president, and immediately CIA assets go into action to arrange to blame the crime on Castro. So, was the assassination a kind of knockoff of Northwoods, or a derivation of Northwoods? I think that's one analytical possibility that you have to consider. And the fact that Northwoods was kept secret from all JFK investigations is an indication of how sensitive it might have been. Because if people had known in 1963 that the Pentagon had a plan to provoke a war with Cuba by staging a violent incident in the United States, people might have said, well, did they have anything to do with what was going on in Dallas?
That's
Did they
what
have anything
they
to do with
do.
it?
That's what military and intelligence agencies do. They've been doing that throughout the Cold War. I mean, I think there's a lot of circumstantial leaps there. I mean, I know these documents quite well, and I understand, but there's a lot more than Northwoods. There was a meeting a couple of weeks before that, and Bromley Smith wrote a long memorandum about it, basically saying Kennedy's committed. Now, there's no doubt the Miami Cubans. I mean, I would say if you're going to pursue a conspiracy theory, that's always been the one that I thought may have made some sense. But Kennedy was pretty resolute, and with regard to Vietnam, he was actually far more hawkish than the military was, who had no real interest in Vietnam. So I mean, we can focus on. No, I know. I mean, I've written 350. I'll send you a PDF of my book on it. I'm serious.
No, I mean, okay. No, I take your position, but
yeah,
the fact was that the Joint Chiefs were very unhappy with Kennedy's plans to limit involvement in Vietnam.
They wanted to take a more aggressive approach. Some of them did, not all.
And within days after Kennedy's death, they get what they want. So there was a policy change that accompanied the violent death of the president. So, but let's just go back, because I want to talk about, Kennedy was all in. Kennedy was a hawk on Cuba. I mean, that's true, okay? But you need to look at what his enemies thought. His enemies did not think he was firm on Cuba. Now, you may think he was firm, and he might have been firm compared to other people or other proposals in the government.
Cubans thought he was firm. Hey, the people besieged by U.S. I mean, he's approving operations throughout late 62 and 63.
That's true. But when Lisa Howard, the ABC newswoman, went to Havana in April 1963 and talked with Castro, and Castro said, look, we're open to a deal. We're open. And he said that the fact that Kennedy had cracked down on the exiles in Miami was a positive step. So Lisa Howard took that message. It went to Helms. Helms and McCone were like, they were scared that Kennedy was going to take up the negotiating track, and they didn't want Howard's information to even get to the president. McCone wanted it to stop with Bobby. And at that time, Kennedy doesn't respond. But by the fall, he has authorized Bill Atwood to make back-channel contacts with the Cubans to see what might be the contours of a deal. And so he was advancing that plan at the same time that he was approving hit-and-run attacks, that sort of thing, on Cuba, and at the same time that he was repudiating the much harder line policy that was sought by the Joint Chiefs and by congressional Republicans. So that's, at that time, the hatred of Kennedy's policies has reached a fever pitch, because he's not doing anything. Yes, he approves some raids, he doesn't approve others. Bill Harvey and the other operational officers think that they're amateurs and fuck-ups. They want a much more aggressive policy. Helms goes to the White House, shows Kennedy a gun 3 days before he's killed. And, his message was, get serious, Mr. President. Men are sacrificing their lives for your policy. And I think that it was a warning. not that Helms knew that the president was going to be killed, but that they thought Kennedy was soft, and they thought they had to provoke him, move him, pressurize him into a harsher policy, and Kennedy didn't want to do it. So I think that's the context that the assassination takes place. And then, to me, another giveaway is not only did no one lose their job, but the president gets shot by an avowed leftist, and the CIA doesn't do two things. They never try and trace, did he act at the behest of the Cubans? They never did that. And more generally, Angleton never does a counter-espionage investigation of Oswald. A simple, damage report. How did this happen? And there's no such document that comes from the counterintelligence staff, who clearly had the responsibility to do it. And there were people who did want to do it. John Whitten was the chief of the Mexico desk in the CIA at the time. He was in on some of the pre-assassination Oswald cables. And after the assassination, he said that he wanted to, based on what he had learned about Oswald's Cuban connections, he wanted to go to Miami. And he said that especially if he had known about the Castro assassination plots, he would have considered the analytical possibility that Castro had somehow gotten wind of that and had struck first and had killed Kennedy instead of vice versa. That never happens. In fact, when Whitten goes to a meeting on Christmas Eve, 1963, with Helms and Angleton chews him out, and Helms takes him off the case. And after that, there was no counter-espionage investigation of Oswald. Why wouldn't you investigate the killer of Kennedy, for his connections to the guy you're trying to kill? Well, one reason might be that if you investigated Oswald, what you would find was his connections did not go to Cuban intelligence. His connections went to the CIA. So the CIA wasn't going to investigate itself. And so they did nothing. And they said, oh, this guy shot the president, move along. It's not important. And if you think otherwise, you're an anti-American nut. And that was a very effective line that the CIA took. And it, by the time of the Garrison trial, it had marginalized critics of the Warren Commission and largely silenced them. But the case that the Warren Commission was wrong only grew stronger, as more evidence emerged. So, when I got to this, I was like, I didn't know what to think. But the official story, the more I learned about it and the more I researched and did interviews with people, the official story was obviously a cover story. Oswald was not a lone nut who came out of nowhere. He was a guy who was of interest to the very highest echelon of the CIA on the eve of Kennedy's assassination. So, what does that mean? Well, when the CIA is still hiding thousands of documents, I think it's kind of commonsensical to say they're hiding something significant. You can't say, oh, we're hiding 4,000 documents, but there's nothing significant in there. Please go away. And please ignore that law that says you have to release them.
Okay, there's a lot there. One, there's a lot of circumstances there, and to somebody who doesn't study this, and it's not like, oh my God, like all these things are pieced together. If you read the documents, I don't think any of this is really extreme or actually surprising. This is the way the government operates. It did it in Greece after World War II, did it in Indonesia. These are the kind of operations. It did it at home with COINTELPRO, with Red Squads. So all of this sounds intriguing, right? Oh, they knew Oswald, and he talked to people in Cuba, and he made a call at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. But when you look at the documentation of it, especially on this idea that Kennedy was somehow dovish, there's nothing there. And I'm kind of arguing something that doesn't exist, right? This stuff isn't there, which makes it a lot harder. And you guys clearly have done a good job, because I think 70% of Americans believe that now. But the reality is, when you say like they're hiding I've done tens of thousands probably of mandatory reviews, because I've done entire collections. And, a couple of years ago, I got stuff back from the JFK library. It had nothing to do with the assassination. It was about early Vietnam, I think strategic Hamlets. And this was 20 some years later, and they wouldn't release it to me. And when I did get stuff, it was still redacted. I think people have this idea that if the government doesn't give you stuff, I mean, the government overclassifies wildly, but
Understood.
you know, and that's the way kind of intelligence agencies work. It's so, you're making this leap that there are a handful of people, and you're saying conspiracies can involve, a small group of people. So there's a handful of people who don't like his policy. I'm assuming it's in Cuba now, although Stone, I think, emphasized Vietnam a lot more. And I mean, killing the president is kind of a big deal. I mean, that's not something you do casually. And so to think that, like, you have this group of people who are so gung-ho about invading Cuba, even though Kennedy and Romney Smith on November 16th, at the point they're talking to Lisa Howard, is at an NSC meeting where he says Kennedy is taking off what he called the restraint and is engaging in all these operations and subversion. So, I have no doubt that Miami Cubans, they're nuts. And Kennedy did not, do what they wanted to do. No doubt about that, although he paid them lip service. But to suggest, and again, I'm not sure if it's the JCS or CIA, because when you were on Deconstructed recently, I think you backed off of the CIA kind of argument there.
Well, I mean, we don't know who was in charge of the operations we don't know who George Joannides was reporting to. He's the chief of psychological war, COFORT action in Miami. And we don't know who he was working for. But that's a big blank spot in the story, because that operation that develops all this information about Oswald, that is fed to the upper echelons of the CIA, that's a blank box to us. Now,
do you have anything that actually goes to the assassination? Are there any documents on that actually go to planning for November 22nd at Dealey Plaza? I mean, we have this. Right.
No covert operator.
Exactly. You're not going to write that down. There's no such document exists.
Right. What there is, and what I'm seeking are records of operational activity around Oswald, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, Joannides, and the Warren Commission that are still classified. Now, you say, the government overclassifies and there's no reason to withhold them. Okay. Then turn them over and show that Morley's wrong.
I agree with you. I agree with that. I'm a writer. I'm a researcher, so I want everything released. But at the same time, I mean, to suggest, okay, Joannides is doing this stuff with the Fair Play, with the student directorate group, and he's doing kind of deep cover, and I mean, all that's true, but none of that surprises me in the least. Of course
okay. So
this is what they did to every group that existed in the 1960s.
Right. But when Kennedy was killed, only one group had the funding and the media contacts to blame the crime on Cuba. That was a CIA funded group run by Joannides. Okay, so don't say the evidence isn't direct. We know that Joannides paid the Cuban Student Directorate for three things: intelligence collection, propaganda, and political action. Okay? On August 1st, when Joannides takes over as the covert action officer, at that point, Lee Harvey Oswald had no public profile as a defender of Castro or a defender of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He had handed out pamphlets once before and attracted no attention. 30 days later, by September 1st, 1963, the CIA, the FBI, and the largest TV and radio stations in New Orleans all have documented evidence of Oswald, the FPCC activist, an activist for the group that has been targeted by senior CIA operations officers, not FBI. FBI is usually associated with COINTELPRO. The COINTELPRO that was targeting the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was run by the CIA. So here's Oswald of the FPCC. The CIA is paying the Cuban Student Directorate for these things. When Oswald shows up at Carlos Bringuier's store, over the next couple of weeks, the DRE collects intelligence on him and sends it back to Washington. They engage in political action. They confront him on the street. They get into a fight with him, and they generate propaganda. Okay, so Joannides is paying them to do that.
Right.
Oswald shows up and they do it. Okay, now the official story is that's a coincidence. Okay, and I say that's not a coincidence. that reflected some intentionality by the CIA operations officers who were targeting the Fair Play for Cuba committee.
And that they were thinking ahead to having him take the fall for killing Kennedy?
Good question. Good question. That's the question it raises. And so we need to see those documents to see that was going on.
Or is that a smoking gun? I mean, is that it? You said it was a smoking gun.
I said it was a smoking gun proof of CIA interest in Oswald. Yes, it is.
I have no problem believing that.
So then let's see.
But you mentioned the CIA rather than the FBI. I mean, from AG, from Marchetti and Marks, we've known that again for a long, long time. The CIA was involved in domestic surveillance activities, which you should not be doing, right?
No argument from me.
Right. I'm saying you're the guy on this. I can't tell you anything you don't know. You're watching and listening to the Green and Red podcast, and we're talking with Jefferson Morley, a well-known journalist who's written voluminously about the JFK assassination and who's been at the forefront of getting documents declassified from the CIA regarding that incident. This is an issue we've talked about extensively on Green and Red over the past year or so, including an interview with Noam Chomsky about JFK and Oliver Stone's work, and a debate between me and the screenwriter for Oliver Stone's documentary. If you like this and other great topics, and we've had over a dozen shows on Ukraine, and we've been covering the coup in Peru recently, just to name a couple, please continue to support us. You can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Most importantly, please share this and subscribe on YouTube or whatever your favorite podcast platform is. And especially tell your friends and comrades about us. Tell them about our Scrappy podcast, where we're doing some of the best politics and history in the left media atmosphere. For more information, you can look us up. We have a link tree at linktree/Green and Red podcast. You can go to our webpage at greenandredpodcast.org. If you want to support us, you can become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast, or you can make a one-time donation at bit.ly/donategnr. Back to part 2 of our interview with Jeff Morley. At the same time, these are, I think, pretty substantial leaps, and it sounds good. Joanidis was here, and Oswald was here, and the
I'll tell you about.
I have no issue in defending the Warren Commission or anybody else. I actually am pretty much atheistic on this one, or agnostic. But at the same time, I think as a scholar who studies this, for one, the idea that Kennedy was somehow going soft or was a champion of civil rights, there's no evidence of that in any kind of historical record. So as a motive, I'm curious.
Okay, but let's hold on there, Bob. Let's hold on there. Okay, on civil rights, Kennedy comes to office, and he's a big disappointment to the civil rights leadership. So when you say there's no sign that he supported civil rights, no. After Medgar Evers was assassinated, he went on national TV.
He was forced. Yeah, okay. He was forced. He was reluctant the whole time.
Of course, he was reluctant, but he did it. Okay, he did it.
Okay, but
and there was a political price to be paid for it. Ambitious politicians in the South all of a sudden had a nice target. Ambitious politicians like George Walker Bush ran against Kennedy's support on the Civil Rights Act. So, this idea, there's no evidence that he was coming around on civil rights. He changed his position on the Civil Rights Act itself. So you can't say there's no change.
I didn't say there was no change. I said he wasn't the biggest supporter. There are always going to be people out there, very extreme. We're seeing them today, right? Who, there are people today calling Biden and Harris socialists. And in Texas, the governor calls everybody a Marxist, right? So there are clearly people out there who are going to have issues with Kennedy. But in the political world, he and Johnson both had decent relations with people like Richard Russell, for instance, even though they may have disagreed on that. So again, I'm saying as approximate reason for assassination, I think that again, I don't see any evidence of it. Vietnam, I definitely don't. I know that very well. Even on Cuba, I get it. There are people in the military too. The idea that the military has these false flags, which are common. They're not new. I mean, I see, talk of false flag operations.
I'm not saying it's new.
I know, but I mean, it's
at
not
least 60 years
old. I mean, it
old.
sounds like when you're talking, and like I said, you're the guy, but when you're talking about that to average people, when they hear that, it's quite startling, right? Oh my God, there's a false flag.
It should be.
It should be. But it's not. It's not new. It's not unusual. This is what the government does. They try to provoke crises and take advantage of them.
So why is it out of bounds? Why is it out of bounds to think about Kennedy's assassination as the possible result of Northwoods?
I mean, that's a hell of a stretch. One that doesn't have any.
Okay. So I go back to my original evidence. Okay, somebody staged a violent, spectacular act of violence. Okay, CIA assets immediately seek to blame the crime on Cuba. Okay,
makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. So, did they intend to do that? Well, let's look at that CIA group.
They're not going to blame the mafia because Kennedy was banging Giancana's girlfriend. I mean, they're not going to do that publicly. So, you have to find somebody.
You have to find somebody what?
Well, I mean, if you want to create the idea that somebody killed him for a particular reason, you have to find somebody. The CIA and the government's not going to come out and say the mafia did it because Kennedy, whatever, because Bobby went after the mafia because he was having an affair, whatever. So you need an excuse. Cuba's great. Cuba's being used a lot in the early 60s to justify all kinds of stuff. It's justifying, weapon systems. It's justifying the arms race. It's justifying the OAS interventions in places like Guyana and Brazil. The threat, I mean, Castro was invoked in every document dealing with Latin America, which I've looked at like a ton of them. So the idea that you're going to pinpoint something on Castro is not at all surprising. It would be kind of more surprising, I think, if they didn't try to drag Cuba into this. I mean, I don't have any proof that the CIA didn't have anything to do with it, but I don't need it. I mean, I can only go by kind of Occam's razor and what we know. And as you point out, there's not going to be a document that kind of links these things together. So until then, I mean, I think for the sake of history, and at the end, I do want to talk because you recently written some about the left, because I think as a leftist, I don't like the way this heads. Oh, go ahead. I mean,
so why do you think that 1 month after the assassination, Harry Truman writes an op-ed in the Washington Post calling for the abolition of the clandestine service? What was the thought process that went into that, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, Truman had been critical of the CIA it started with him since its origin.
Right, but he had never called for its abolition until.
But that doesn't prove that they killed Kennedy. It doesn't say.
No. It doesn't prove that they killed Kennedy. It indicates very strongly that Truman thought they killed Kennedy.
No, it indicates that Truman thought the CIA was out of control, which it might have been. But I mean.
Yeah. Okay.
The CIA is doing tons of things.
Truman thought the CIA was out of control as a result of Kennedy's assassination, but somehow we can't conclude that.
But how do you conclude that? How do you conclude that
Harry Truman concluded it? He knew a lot more than
the CIA killed Kennedy.
Why else did he write that op-ed?
I don't know, but I mean, you can't say he did it because he thought the CIA killed Kennedy.
Sure you can. He started writing it on the day that the FBI report on Oswald was released, okay? So he was motivated by Kennedy's assassination and the initial finding, this guy was a lone nut, he had no co-conspirators. If you disagree, you're an un-American lunatic. Everybody, let's move along. And Harry Truman didn't want to do that. Harry Truman thought President Kennedy had been killed by enemies in the CIA. Bobby and Jackie Kennedy came to the same conclusion. Lyndon Johnson came to the same conclusion. Win Scott came to the same conclusion. Charles de Gaulle, Fidel Castro. What I'm talking about isn't eccentric, and it's not based on a lack of evidence or a lack of serious people believing it. All of those people, none of them qualify as a deranged conspiracy theorist.
I agree.
I take their analysis of the assassination very seriously. You don't. You think it's not important.
I don't know. I didn't say anything. I have to go by documentation. When you were recently on Deconstructed, you said I backed off on the kind of CIA-centric analysis of the assassination the CIA operations around Oswald are crucial, but that doesn't mean the CIA was calling the shots. Well, it seems like right now you're saying that the CIA was calling the shots. And
again, if you go back and look at how these operations are structured, you know, and you look at the kind of the power structure of the U.S. in 1961, the CIA is a pretty junior agency. It's only been around for 16 years, right? The Joint Chiefs are, you know, in terms of budget and power and influence, they are the major movers and shakers. So, you know, Kennedy's assassination could have been the result of a military operation incorporating some CIA assets. One of the things that I think I want to see is, what was Joe Aniti's cover in 1963 after he takes over the DRE? Because in the records that I've found, you see this burst of compartmentalization. And these are the documents that they really, really, really don't want to surrender. And this is, you're going to see, Bob, you're going to see this is where the fight's going to be this year, because they're going to say, those aren't JFK records. And that's how they're going to get out of it, by not being, because it's operational activity that they can't talk about. So, you know, so I don't know who Joe Aniti's was responding to. That's what's hidden in the records. In Greece, Joe Aniti's operated under military cover. So he might have gone over into military cover in 1963, and everything he did after that was basically a military operation, or a military directed operation, rather than a CIA directed operation. So that's why I said about what I said about, you know, who gave the nod at the end of the day for monkey business around the president. You know, to me, it's, I'm not sure CIA people would have done it without a nod from the Joint Chiefs. So,
but we need some kind
you
of,
know, that's one of the things we want to identify.
we need some kind of link. I mean,
What's
the DHS was kind of getting pretty much everything on. It's getting massive budgets, getting new weapon systems, getting Polaris. No, I mean,
they did not get the.
I'll send you some other stuff I've written. I've done a lot on this, you know.
No, I understand that.
And the thing is, like,
and I'm not disagreeing with you.
What's striking
I'm not
is, like,
disagreeing with you.
I know, but you guys control your argument controls the public debate on this. I mean, I can't. No one's interested. Like,
are you kidding, Bob?
You guys,
I've been working on this issue for 20 years, and this time around was the first time that skeptics of the official story, I mean, were treated with a modicum of respect. It's the first time. In the mainstream media, there is a profound unwillingness, which is changing now because people see exactly what they're hiding, and they say, well, what do you say to what Morley's saying? And their answer is, we have no answer, okay? So we have not been shaping the story all along. We've been faced with almost uniform hostility and ridicule promoted by the CIA and engaged by mainstream news media organizations, which are now beginning to realize, hey, like, maybe they're taking us for a ride. You know, it was bullshit that Oswald was a loner who nobody knew about. It really was bullshit. That was a big lie that was foisted on the American people. And all these liberals complain about, you know, Trump's big lie. The lone gunman was a big lie, you know, and we still have people, you know, kind of browbeating you and say, how dare you doubt this? Well, Harry Truman doubted it. Lyndon Johnson doubted it. Charles de Gaulle doubted it. It's not eccentric for me to doubt it. It's very factual.
I've never used the word eccentric. I think I'm not defending government declassification. I hope all this stuff is released at the same time. You know, it seems like you're saying that it's almost like I keep thinking, remember what it was Rumsfeld said, the absence of evidence is not, or the evidence of absence, not the absence of evidence, or something like that. It's kind of like, since these documents are declassified, that's the proof that something happened that needed to be classified.
No. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence in this case. Absence of evidence is evidence of operational activity, okay? The reason these documents are withheld, the CIA tells us, is because they contain records of operational activity. So don't say that I'm inventing something that's not there.
No, I'm not.
According to the CIA, not according to Morley, according to the CIA, these documents are about operational activities that are too sensitive to be aired even 60 years later.
Right, which is,
okay?
I've seen that on Vietnam stuff. I've gotten the same response. I'm not defending the CIA. I'm just saying this is what the CIA does.
I know it's what the CIA does. So some people say, oh, they lied to us from day one about who Oswald was, and they lied to the Warren Commission, they lied to the House Select Committee, they even lied to the JFK Review Board in the 90s. And you say, but that doesn't mean anything, okay? Some of us are a little more skeptical. It does mean something. It means it reflects an intention to deceive, okay?
Yes,
That's what's...
I do think that, I agree with you.
Right.
That's what they do, they deceive.
Right, so if there was a group of CIA officers who conspired against Kennedy and they're hiding it right now, that would be entirely consistent with what I'm saying. And you're saying it's not possible.
No, I didn't say it wasn't possible. I said there's no link to it. I mean, I can say that they have.
Let's go back, Bob.
I can say they have proof of.
Bob, let's go back to it. We already went through this, okay? You say there's no link to it. Joanides ran the Cuban Student Directorate. The Cuban Student Directorate
had him in Dealey Plaza. There's a hell of a gap there between.
Hold on.
Operations, which I agree with you. I mean, we have nothing to disagree about.
So don't say there's no link. There is
to an assassination. There isn't. To an actual assassination, there isn't. That's a big deal.
There's a link. No, there's a link.
Conspiracy since Julius Caesar. That's a big deal.
Let me finish the thought.
Okay. I'm not.
You say there's no link. Okay.
Right.
There is a link. Okay. The link is Oswald. Okay. The guy arrested for killing the president.
Right.
Okay. The link is a CIA funded group publicized his activities before and after the assassination. Okay. There's the link. I'm not inventing that. That's proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
And I don't
like this. So let's just take that. So on the day of the assassination, the CIA's assets are seeking successfully to shape the media coverage of what just happened. And the CIA's assets are promoting the story while denying that the CIA has anything to do with it, that Cuba was responsible for the crime. Okay, so don't say there's no connection. There's the connection. The connection is Joanides' operational activity, which is still shrouded in secrecy. You say, oh, that couldn't possibly be. And I say, I'm telling you,
there's no evidence of it. I mean,
no evidence of what?
Of these people having anything to do with Dealey Plaza. There's just not. You've admitted it.
Oswald had something to do with Dealey Plaza.
Oswald. But let's. I mean, first of all, I kind of agree with Stone where in the movie where he says this stuff is scenery and parlor games are the words he uses. So I don't really get caught up in that. I don't want to because I don't know it that well. But let's just throw this out there. Oswald is a communist. He defected. May have been disillusioning, but he defected, came back. He was an advocate of Cuba. He had mental and psychological issues. So why isn't it possible that he wanted to kill a president who was trying to overthrow Fidel Castro? Why not?
Well, okay. First, he denied doing it.
Well, I wouldn't say that's prima facie evidence of much.
Well, if you're saying that he wanted to achieve a political goal, why would he deny responsibility for the crime?
Because he didn't want to admit to murdering a president. I mean, I don't.
But you just said he wanted to do it to defend his friend Fidel Castro.
To defend the revolution. Yeah, that doesn't. Why would you? Of course, okay, I mean, killing a president's a big deal. Yeah, he knows he's going to get the death penalty. I mean, lying about committing a murder is hardly evidence.
And he didn't just deny it, Bob. Right? He said he was a patsy, right? Which,
perhaps,
if you follow the Northwood scenario, right, was to create a patsy, right? That's what a false flag operation is.
I know.
Okay, so why is it? There's your connection.
If you want to create, are you suggesting that they could have created a false flag far short of actually killing a president? It's like 9/11. I mean, if you want to justify a war against Iraq, you don't need to blow up the World Trade Center. So sometimes I think, people kind of try to create these proximate causes. I mean, yeah, the government wanted excuses. As I said, Lansdale had bizarre ideas about contriving some kind of incident to justify an actual invasion of Cuba.
Right. So Lansdale was a one-star general.
I know.
The Joint Chiefs were 5-star generals, and this wasn't a one-off policy paper. This was the official policy of the Joint Chiefs.
I'm familiar with all of that, and yes, they wanted to get rid of Castro, no doubt. But there's.
But why didn't they investigate the possibility that Castro was behind Oswald?
I don't know. That doesn't prove.
I do know, because an investigation of Oswald would have led back to the CIA officers who knew the most about him, who were very high ranking, and they would have all lost their jobs. So that's what they had.
Why not cover that up then? Why not cover up the fact that you knew this guy and you botched it?
Well, Bob, I think that when a president is assassinated, we don't give the government excuses to not obey the law. I think the government should obey the law. The
government ever obeyed the law? The government doesn't release documents. The government doesn't tell you what it's doing. It never has.
Right. And you know what, Bob? They're not telling you about their pre-assassination interest in Oswald.
Perhaps.
They're not.
A lot of the stuff they've done, we do know. Like, I'm familiar with. Like this one, I get it. It's a big deal. But at the same time, as we both said, I mean, you're not going to find like some kind of document that says this is what we're going to do on November 22nd. No one's saying that. No one's going to write that down. I also think that, I
never thought that.
What?
Never thought that.
No, I know. No, I said we agree on that. Absolutely. But I think, let me just, because I know we're going
to don't say there's no connection.
Because I said there's no direct link to November, except for Oswald. You're right, but there's no direct government.
Except for the guy who they've been watching for 4 years and called himself a patsy. There's no link. Otherwise,
Of course, I've been watching him. He defected. He was a defector. But that doesn't that doesn't give the government agency for this murder. And I'm not defending the government. I don't really know. But at the same time, let me just like finish up here, because I know we're both going on. But like, and one thing you just recently wrote, you have a Substack, which is called what, JFK Facts, I believe.
Yeah.
Tell people how to get to that. And you talked about the left and the right, and you basically said the left basically supports the official version now. And I just, like, as somebody on the left, I actually think it's very different. And when I said you've kind of won the debate, that's like, you're all over you and Eugenio and these people, you're all over the place. You're on all these lefty podcasts. You're in Jackman, you're in The Nation, you're in Counterpunch. Nobody wants to talk to me. Even Chomsky has issues. Like, people don't really want to talk to him anymore, right? So I think the idea that we're kind of creating this image of a heroic Kennedy who was going to end the Cold War and usher in this new Canaan is very dangerous. It's heroicizing him like these crazy people heroicize Trump. And again, I mean, the government does bad things, and the fact that the CIA does really horrendous, horrible, evil things, which we both agree on, doesn't create proof that they killed the president. I keep saying killing the president's a pretty big deal. And
yeah, but the government's credibility is shot because they've lied so much over the years. Yeah. And the reason people talk to me is because my explanation is more credible than your explanation.
So if they lie, why are they going to give you documents that undermine their own lies?
They were forced by public opinion to disgorge all these documents after 30 years, which they plan to keep secret forever. So
I'm glad they did. But I think we would both agree most of those documents should have never been classified initially.
Right, but they were, right?
Yeah.
And the reason that they were was because the CIA had something to hide. They weren't classified for no reason. And the reason, you keep on ignoring the pattern of deception, right?
No, I know quite well. I think having something to hide is true. Hiding the assassination of the president is qualitatively and quantitatively very different, very, very much bigger. It does have a different standard of proof.
Right. What they're
hiding in Guatemala or a coup in Iran or something.
What they're hiding is the operational interest in Oswald. That's what they're hiding in 2022. That's what they're lying about in 2022. You say, well, it's of no consequence. They've lied before. And I say, well, if they were running an operation, if senior officials approved an operation involving Oswald while Kennedy was still alive, people are going to want answers from the CIA.
And I hope all the documents are released. I never said it wasn't important. My point is that the fact that they're running an operational investigation of Oswald doesn't strike me at all. Is anything unusual?
Well, no, but that's not
the
point. That's not.
That is the point. I mean, if you're going to create this, Oswald to Ioannidis to Dealey Plaza, then there has to be some kind of really concrete like link and motive. And
right. And on here's the connection. On the night of November 22nd, the leaders of the DRE call Ioannidis and they say, "What should we do?" And Joanides says, take your stuff to the FBI and go public. Okay. He doesn't call them in and say, hey, who was this guy Oswald? How did you get in touch with him? He lets the operation unfold. Okay. You say there's no direct connection. There's your direct connection. Joanides talks to the DRE boys on the night of November 22nd, and they turn over their file on Oswald, intelligence collection done with CIA funds. So we're talking money, and then they turn around and they lie to the investigation about this. So you keep saying there's no consequence or there's no meaning to the deception. And I say there is. And you say there's no connection. And I say, look at the deception. Look at what they're lying about. They were lying about it on November 22nd, and they're still concealing it today and pretending that these aren't JFK records because they have something very serious to hide. Now, you think that I'm making this all up and,
No, I don't.
No.
I don't think you're making anything up.
Credible.
I definitely
my story is more credible than yours. And that's
okay.
why
I considering I have documentary evidence and you don't, I don't know if it's more.
I do have the documentary evidence. Look at the Joanides personnel file.
This is evidence of these circumstantial links that don't prove that somebody killed the president.
No, it proves that they were running an operation around Oswald and that they're still hiding information about that. So let's get that evidence.
I'm fine with that. I hope they do. I hope you do. And I appreciate the documents. I appreciate your lawsuit.
So why did Joanides not talk to the House Select Committee? Why did he lie to them when they asked him who was running the DRE in 1960?
You pointed that out. I mean, there are countless reasons that intelligence operatives don't want to talk.
Right, and one of them is that they didn't want to disclose an operation involving Oswald to investigators because they didn't.
They maybe didn't want to. I mean, there's a million things, right? And maybe they screwed up. They didn't want to disclose that. They didn't want to disclose who they were operating. I mean,
there is no indication in anywhere in the record. First of all, in the pre-assassination Oswald file, there's nothing that says this guy's a loser of no interest, pay no attention to him. Okay, there's nothing like that. To the contrary, there's a lot of evidence that shows there were a lot of people very interested in Oswald. And as time went on, that interest extended to higher and higher ranks, a fact that the CIA hid from all of these investigations. So you have high-level people who are lying to a murder investigation, and you have low-level people like Joanides who are lying to investigators. Again, you see no meaning.
No, I know, I'm not, but I do know that the FBI and CIA were keeping files on Frank Sinatra and
yes,
Lucille
that's true.
Ball. I mean, we're right on the cusp of, I mean, the Cold War's still, flaming. It's right out. I mean, McCarthyism is still vibrant.
Right, but Lucille Ball wasn't accused of killing Kennedy.
No, but my point is, this is what the CIA does. They keep records that doesn't indicate anything that links you to a murder. We're talking
if somebody lies in a murder investigation, that doesn't mean that they might have had something to do with a murder. Why would you conclude that? Huh? Really?
There's no way a reasonable DA, you couldn't get an indictment on Oswald.
Let's say that happened on your block.
For what? Let alone a conviction.
Let's say it happened on your block, Bob. Your neighbor gets murdered by a guy, and then somebody comes along and kills the guy who killed your neighbor. Would you say, oh, one lone nut killed another lone nut? There wasn't anything else going on.
It's not impossible.
Okay,
and then
Robin's
razor, it happened. That's what happened. I mean,
Oswald, and then another neighbor.
And there's a legit question because I know some people say he did. Did you believe Oswald actually fired the gun to kill Kennedy?
No, I don't think so. I mean, he might have fired a gun. He wasn't the intellectual author of Kennedy's death.
Okay, and nor the actual agent of it.
I don't think so.
Okay,
I don't think so.
I don't follow what Stone called parlor games and scenery. That seems quite, I mean, it's difficult for me to explain or believe, but I'm not gonna get into it anyway. Anything?
Just don't say that I don't have direct evidence. Okay.
Of the murder, of the assassination, of the plan, of the plot. You don't. It just doesn't exist, and I don't think you'll ever find it. I don't think. If there was this kind of a plan,
I'm not looking for it. I'm looking for the operational interest in Oswald, which is still undisclosed for reasons
and that's
that you,
fine.
for
But that
reasons
doesn't
that you
crack
cannot
that doesn't crack
explain.
the Kennedy case. That doesn't. Well, I can't explain because I didn't do it. I didn't classify it. I'm familiar with the way things are classified, so this does not strike me as being out of the uncustomary, not out of custom for what
I
these
mean,
intelligence agencies do. And you know that better than me.
Congress passes a law and says all this stuff should be made public. They set a 25-year deadline. The CIA blows the deadline under Trump. They blow the deadline under Biden. They've blown it again under Biden. They don't want to disclose this information. You can say, oh, they're just hiding trivial information at this point. If the information I'm seeking is trivial, then release it.
I agree. But as somebody who's done a fairly significant amount of research in several decades now, this stuff, this is what they do. They classify massive reams of information, and you can't get at it. And I mean, if it involves a source, then I think these things are classified by them into perpetuity. So again, like I get what you're saying, and it sounds good, but as somebody who's done it, like a significant amount of work in the archives, nothing you've said strikes me as being out of custom for these agencies. And for ask any professor. There's a 30-year rule. There's a 30-year rule on declassification that the government just ignores.
Right.
I mean, it just on stuff that isn't about assassinating a president.
I guess the difference between us, Bob, is I see a pattern of deception by the CIA that started 60 years ago and continues today around the agency's interest in Oswald. Consistent lying to law enforcement and official investigative bodies. You attach no significance to that record of deception, and I
don't attach no significance. I don't doubt you. I just don't think that leads to a plan to kill the president. And I'm not going to play counterfactual here. Like, what if they did this? What if they did that? I don't like doing that. That's not history. So,
yeah, I mean, a lot of people around Kennedy thought that he had been killed by his enemies, who had the ability to do something else. That's a commonsensical position. There's nothing unsupported about it. Okay, Charles de Gaulle and Fidel Castro knew how the CIA operated. They knew how American power functioned. Lyndon Johnson knew how power functioned. Harry Truman knew how power functioned. Bobby and Jackie Kennedy knew how power functioned. So what I'm talking about is very well supported by very well-informed people and accompanied by a consistent record of 60 years of lying by the CIA. You attach no importance to that. And I say it has a bearing that they are hiding something significant.
I didn't say that's not important.
And we will find out this year.
It's something if I were writing, I would certainly look into it, but I could not, based on all that, make any kind of conclusion that there was this plan that the CIA and the JCS or military and intelligence bureaus were involved in this. I just couldn't. If a student presented that to me, I'd say, nah.
Right. My reporting indicates that they have an undisclosed interest in Lee Harvey Oswald. And when we see that, when we take another layer off the onion, we will see the JFK story in a different light. That's what we're headed at. We've learned a lot over the last 30 years.
And if you do come up with a smoking gun, I'll be the first person to say, hey, you got it. I was wrong. But at this point, I just don't see anything of that nature. And I think
just don't say that I don't have direct evidence. The
direct of a plan to kill the president. You have plans, but I've never doubted you. I've never doubted what you said.
We have direct evidence of plans of an operational interest in Oswald held at the highest levels of the CIA. That's why people listen to me, because that's an indisputable fact that remains to be explained. When I filed my lawsuit and the New York Times did a story on it, it was the first time I'd been writing about the Joanides case for a while and could never get them to comment. And the CIA is asked to comment, and they say, we've abided by the law, and and we reject the notion that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy as obscene or something like that. My lawsuit never said anything about conspiracy. They were denying something that they weren't accused of, right? Why was that? Why did they feel necessary?
They kind of know where you're headed on that.
Well,
You can't pick every little thing like that and make it evidentiary. It just,
I didn't say it. The CIA said it.
I think
Don't
they
tell
would
me
like
it's
to
not
think that. I mean,
evidence.
if
Don't tell me it's not evidence. The CIA said it to the New York Times.
I mean, there's a reason you're looking for these documents. So look, I don't want to, I'm not going to defend the CIA. And I think the idea that,
That's a good idea, Bob. That's a good idea.
No,
Don't defend the CIA
I've
on
been
this
studying
one,
this.
because that's a loser. Their behavior is not defensible.
I
think we
don't,
can
and
agree on
I
that.
don't doubt that they were trying to cultivate a source. No doubt. They were doing it all the time. Why wouldn't they? Oswald's a pretty easy mark. He defected, right? I mean, that alone means that's somebody worth talking to and getting to know.
So why lie to the Warren Commission?
Why not? That's what they do.
Why
I don't
not?
know. There are myriad
Bob,
number
Bob,
of things.
that's a loser of an
hiding.
argument. Bob, that's a loser of an argument. Why not lie about a presidential assassination? It's no big deal.
There are myriad things they could be hiding, well short of an assassination of the president. They could be hiding sources. They could be hiding their own incompetence.
The reason the CIA, the reason Congress passed the JFK Records Act was so that people would say the government's not hiding something. Okay. Now they've blown the deadline 4 times, and you say they're not hiding anything.
I didn't say they're not hiding anything. I want all the documents released. I don't know what they're hiding that is going to. They're not hiding anything. I don't think anything exists that's going to say, okay, yeah, the CIA and these.
No, the documents that exist that I'm seeking will show who was directing Joe Aniti's operation involving Oswald and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and the Cuban Student Directorate. Those documents,
that doesn't lead to an assassination of a president. Covert. I mean, if you look at the government in the 1960s, they've infiltrated pretty much every group that exists, foreign and domestic. Communist parties, labor unions, VVAW, Maoist sects. They're doing this. Why not go after Oswald? Why not?
They did.
I know. Why not?
And they hid it. Why? And they're still hiding it. Why? Because there was nothing to it.
No, I didn't say that. I think
we're hiding evidence that exonerates us. Let us do that. Give me a break. Your position is the CIA.
What evidence would there be to exonerate them? Documents? No, we're not going to kill Kennedy on November 22nd. I mean,
no. If what I'm talking about in the Joe Aniti's files doesn't reflect an interest in Oswald and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, there will be no evidence of it in that file.
Okay, and is that going to get rid of everyone who says that the Kennedy? Is that going to convince every conspiracy theorist that they were wrong?
I'm not trying to convince every conspiracy theorist. I'm not interested in conspiracy.
My point is that this isn't going to. I mean, all right. Most likely,
do I think that we will have decisive clarification of the JFK story in 2023? Yes, I do.
Okay.
When we see those records, we will have a new understanding of the causes of Kennedy's assassination.
Look, I'm not against documentation being released. It would help me.
I mean, the important part of the story here, Bob, is, if I'm wrong, the CIA can prove it tomorrow. Okay. The clock's ticking. Let's watch. How long does it take before they release these records? And what arguments do they make to try and prevent them from being released?
Well, we both know what kind of arguments they're going to make. They're going to cite national security. They're going to cite intelligence sources. They're going to,
of course they do.
They're going to go back to the stuff they always said.
Right. To the way that they deceived the Warren Commission.
And the way they deceived everything.
No. I'm not talking about everything.
I'm
not talking about everything. I'm talking about what did they do in the case of the murdered president.
They did what they always do. That doesn't mean they were involved in an assassination plot. There are a myriad reasons short of that, that are kind of factual, but I think what you're arguing is kind of factual too. I mean, there's no evidence of it. I agree to the point where you said they were conducting an operation on Oswald and Joe Aniti's part. You've shown that.
And so then the question is, so why are they hiding it?
Tons of reasons. I don't know specifically, but there's a lot of reasons.
Nobody knows.
Assassination.
Yeah, that's the point. The CIA doesn't.
I agree with you. I hope they release them all unredacted. I absolutely agree with you on that. So
Okay.
anyway, I actually really do appreciate this, even though, we disagree. I think this was, conducted in a pretty civil manner, all things considered.
Yeah.
And,
Thanks for listening.
and no, I've read everything you've done, and like I said, I've been following your work for a long time, and I really do appreciate it. And yeah, this isn't going away anytime soon, and I'm gonna send you some stuff on email, some stuff I've written, just so you know where I'm coming from. And
Okay. So if people are interested in
yeah,
this conversation, they can go to jfkfacts.substack.com, subscription newsletter, JFK News, 5 days a week. I recommend to you the interview I posted today with Ernst Titovitz, who was Oswald's best friend in Russia. And he's still alive. He's a scientist in Minsk now. And we had a very interesting conversation. So, we're really looking at the Kennedy assassination very carefully. We're looking at it from a bipartisan, non-ideological point of view. I have readers on JFK Facts Substack from far right to the center to far left. This is an issue on which there is overwhelming public support for full JFK disclosure now. There was a recent poll done on the subject, also on JFK Facts, which kind of describes the latest findings of a reputable national poll about the Kennedy assassination. So my website is the way to keep up with JFK news in 2023, and there's going to be a lot. We have a lawsuit against the president and the National Archives to compel enforcement of the JFK Records Act. This bogus release we had last month is more for the necessity of that lawsuit. We have another deadline coming under Biden's latest memo on the subject, June 30th. And we have the 60th anniversary coming at the end of the year. So there's going to be a lot of JFK news, and let's stay in touch and stay on top of it.
yeah, and I do hope there is full declassification. I really appreciate this, and I've had some issues, but I disagree obviously with you, but I do think among the people who write about this, I take your work far more seriously than anyone else's, and a lot of that has to do because you have a very significant and impressive background. So thank you for joining us on the Green and Red podcast, and I know this is something that we've talked about a lot. Who knows, maybe 6 months from now we'll have another. Thank you, Jefferson Morley, for a great discussion about JFK and the CIA. And thank all of you for watching and listening to us. Please share Green and Red podcast. Please subscribe, rate and review, and follow us on social media. If you want to donate any amount, whether it jingles or folds, you can do that too. You can become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And you can make a one-time donation at bit.ly/donategnr. Also, our friends with Certain Days now have their 2023 Certain Days calendar available, and we have some of those, and we'll send you one with a $25 donation to Green and Red. We also have some books available for people who want to donate to us. So to find out more about that or to ask how to donate, you can contact us at greenredpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much, and